Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about a series of adventures that were inspired by an old video game called Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball. And in my circle of friends, this game is notorious. We all loved it. We were rabid fans of this game when it came out. Um, I'm always a little surprised though how many people I run into these days who don't remember it at all. They've never played it, they never heard of it. And then a lot of people, when they do hear about it, they despise it. They just hate it. Um, my experience was, well, first of all, when I owned my comic book store, I sold Playboy magazine. And, we had comics behind the counter. It was like hentai type stuff. I could order stuff for people. Um, I mean, honestly, you've heard the expression sex sells, right? If I would have gotten rid of all of that sort of stuff, if I would have not carried that in our comic book store, we never would have been in business in the first place. Like, that was at least a fourth of our sales, if not half. I mean, I would have to guess, and I'm sure it probably fluctuated. Actually, at Christmas time, we sold way more. Um, so that was interesting to me. But at any rate, but so I had gotten used to carrying Playboy magazine, and then after the store, after I liquidated it, I was still getting Playboy in the mail, right? And so when I met my wife, like she was bisexual and she kind of enjoyed reading Playboy back then. She doesn't really feel that way now, but back then she did. And so for me, being a young guy in my 20s, that was kind of exciting that instead of like, whatever, trying to hide that from somebody or something like that, it was kind of nice to be able to share it with her. And like the new issue would come, she'd read it before I would, you know? And back in those days, um, when we were dating and living together and stuff like that, um, we used to watch like hentai anime and stuff like that all the time. Um, and honestly, I kind of look back on all that fondly myself. I thought that was cool to have somebody to do that with. And it's the connection. That's kind of the big takeaway for me is it was nice to have that connection with somebody. And so when this video game was getting ready to come out, we read about it in Playboy first. And um we both thought it looked cool. And then my best friend at the time was Chris Cross, and he got his hands on a copy and he brought it over to our house and he's like, "You have to play this game." And so we did. And I was like, "Oh yeah, yeah. I saw this in Playboy. I was wanting to check it out." And I thought it was such a cool game. And a lot of people would be really quick to dismiss it as, TNA or whatever. And it's not like it wasn't those things, but for me, and granted, all this information is 20 years out of date now or something. But at the time, being able to hit the buttons on the controller where if you mashed it down really hard, like the girl would jump higher. And if you just barely tapped it, she would kind of like barely jump. You know what I mean? And and honestly, the thing I did the least was play volleyball. I think I had some hand-eye coordination issue there where I was not as good. But there was another thing that we really like to do because it was all these, I don't know if you call them mini games or what. I'm not, you can probably tell. I'm not a huge video game guy, right? Um, I haven't played a video game for years now. Even back then, it was kind of hit and miss. I was only kind of 50% interested in video games. Back in like the 8-bit era in the 80s, like I loved video games. And it was sort of like basically every Nintendo that comes out, I am like half as interested in that as I was in the one before it. So like I was, 100% interested in the Nintendo Entertainment System, right? From the 80s. And then I was like 50% interested into the Super Nintendo. And then I was like only 25% into like the N64, so on and so forth. Well, so and that's just me. Obviously, your mileage may vary. I feel very unusual in that respect. I feel like everybody likes video games more than I do. I don't know. It's just not my thing. But at any rate, but I loved this game. I was 100% into this game. And my favorite thing to do was this thing where they had a swimming pool and they had these like pool floaties and you were trying to jump from floaty to floaty and go across, like run across the surface of the water, basically. And that thing I was talking about with how hard you mashed the buttons, that had a big effect on whether or not you could accomplish that, right? And you learned sort of that sweet spot where if you hit the button too light, you failed. If you hit it too heavy, you failed. And then I think you were hitting two buttons for like right foot, left foot. I could be wrong. I haven't played it for like 20 years. Um, but I just remember thinking that was really, really cool. And I hadn't played a game like that before that. And of course, like I said, I grew up in that 8-bit era, with like the original Super Mario Brothers on the NES, and you know what those characters look like, heavily pixelated. The Super Nintendo was better, but it was still like pixelated. N64, in my opinion, looks pretty rough these days by modern standards. Obviously, I know a lot of people are nostalgic for that look. I am not one of them myself. Um, More power to you if you are. But so when beach volleyball came out, I thought it was like it blew my mind how good the graphics were, right? Um, I don't know. I thought it was an awesome game. And everybody I knew thought it was an awesome game. And so we were like having parties that were like beach volleyball parties where people were coming over to our apartment. And I mean, we'd have a room full of people between my friends and my wife's friends. You'd have like a dozen people sitting around eating pizza. And that I remember too, that was right around the time Little Caesars changed how they were doing things. So actually, where I lived, the Little Caesars pizza, which Little Caesars was pretty good before they went cheap. Like they were just as good as anybody else's pizza was. Where I lived, I understand. Again, your mileage may vary, every place is different. But but at any rate, they started to do the $5 pizzas or whatever it was right around this time. And I remember us having a lot of pizza parties then, and like it was still good. The quality hadn't taken a big dive yet. Because like now where I live, it's like ordering a big circular piece of cardboard with some ketchup on it or something. It really sucks really bad now. But at any rate, but back then, like it was kind of awesome. And so I associate the two, where we were drinking beer, eating pizza, playing beach volleyball. And there were a lot of girls around. And my wife and I had gotten married. Most of our friends, well, maybe not most, but a good many of them were single. So then that was another thing is when they were coming over, like my friends were hitting on her friends, stuff like that. But yeah, so we were playing beach volleyball and it was so popular. And so it kind of became inevitable that we wanted to do something like this in the role playing game, right? And so we started talking about it and we didn't love everything about the video game. So we weren't super beholden to it, right? And so the first thing everybody agreed on that was completely unanimous was the guy who hosts. Well, let me tell you this first. Okay. So in the game, there's a character named Zach, who I think is based on Dennis Rodman. He certainly seems to be, anyways. And I always hated Dennis Rodman. I just think he's obnoxious, and I just cannot stand the guy. And I'll be real honest. Part of that was I was always kind of like I thought Carmen Electra was hot back in the day, and then the fact she hooked up with Dennis Rodman makes you kind of hate Dennis Rodman. Maybe other guys can't relate to that. I don't know, but that's kind of how I was back then. But so I hated Zach. Everybody I knew hated the character of Zach in the game. And what it is he tells all the girls from the Dead or Alive franchise, which is fighting games. It's like Street Fighter type stuff, right? And he says, "Yeah, the next tournament or whatever is going to be on my island." And so they show up thinking that they're going to, do martial arts stuff, and instead it's just an excuse for him to see them in bikinis, right? So that's the setup for the game. And then you're there, and I haven't played this for 20 years. So you have to forgive me if I'm wrong. If I'm a little wrong, I feel like the spirit of the thing is there at least. But I believe you're on the island for like 7 days. And then, spoiler, there's a volcano on the island. So at the very end of the vacation, the island sinks into the ocean, gets completely destroyed. And so, point being, everybody we knew despised Zach. So that was the first thing we were going to change is we were going to get Zach out of there. The second thing that we did not like was everybody felt like when you play the game, by the time you get to day 7, you're like you're in the groove and things are going really well and you like how this is going and you want it to continue, right? You don't want the vacation to be over. And you don't want to have to like restart the game or whatever from scratch, and you gotta, do all that stuff over again. We hated that. So we decided in the role-playing version, the first thing, which I'm sure if you follow the channel, you see this coming from a mile away. We traded out Zach for John Redbridge, who I mention all the time, and he's a big GMPC kind of guy in our game. Um, so we did that. And then in our role playing game, before Dead or Alive Beach Volleyball came out, we had played a series of games called the Continuum Bar and Grill, or the CB&G for short, which was a wildly popular thing we did involving a tiki bar on a tropical island. So we're like, hey, that's obviously an awesome place to set this, right? So that's what we did. And then the next thing we did was my game had always been kind of popular with my players because of crossovers. It wasn't just a DC game or just a Marvel game. It was we had both, and we threw in Image Comics and just anything you could think of in terms of comics. Then we did other stuff. So like since Spider-Man met the Transformers, we include them. Since the Savage Dragon met the Turtles, we include them. Everybody's all running around together. It's the world where crossovers take place is kind of how we think of it. And so Street Fighter had met X-Men, right? So we were like, well, there you go. Let's start. We've completely not done the fighting game end of the spectrum. And so we decided that John Redbridge wouldn't just send invitations out to only Dead or Alive girls for some reason. Why would he discriminate? Which wouldn't make sense. He would send them out to everybody. So it could be the girls from Mortal Kombat. It could be the girls from Street Fighter. It could be, you name it, right? Anything and anything and everything. And so we started running that game. And at first, we ran it very similar to the Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball video game, where we were kind of like, okay, your character, you wake up in the morning, what are you going to have for breakfast? A gift arrives at your hotel room. It's from one of the other guests here at the resort, and da 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 da. what gift do you give them? And then I came up with tables to roll on that was kind of reactions to gifts and stuff like that. And it became kind of a dating simulator, you know, and it was really, really popular. And then we were coming up with sometimes we tried the thing of like, I want my character to run across the surface of the water on this swimming pool, jumping from like pool floaty to pool floaty. And I'd be like, okay, give me a dex check for the first one to make sure you land on it correctly. And we were doing stuff like that. That part of it really wasn't fun in a role playing game. It was fun in the video game because of the touch sensitive buttons, where if you mash down on the button really hard, the character does one thing, and if you barely tap it, it does another. And if you got to get the speed down of how fast you're hitting the button is how fast they run across the pool. At any rate, that's all lost when you're just rolling dice. So that part of it didn't work. And then something we started doing was like with my wife's friends who would kind of, and they were barely out of high school. I would have been like 25, and they were younger than me. They were 18, 19, stuff like that. And so they still had a lot of momentum towards wanting to kind of fight with each other out of game, I mean, and be catty and stuff like that. So then that spilled over in game. So if they were playing volleyball, one of them might spike the ball into another girl's face, and then that would start a fight. And so maybe you would get something like Tina Armstrong from DOA facing off against Cammy White from Street Fighter. And then we would actually, yeah, just treat it as a fight, roll initiative. You guys fight. This one's knocked out. And we kind of liked that. We did like a role playing game about a fighting game. And so after a while, we kind of had it all out of our system, and we started just taking the show on the road, and we started doing the Street Fighter thing where then they were going around the world. And so we did it where like all of these girls would then, for instance, go to Japan, and we would pick a location there, like an airport or something, and there would be, fights there, and then we were rolling for that. And we started to keep track of all the player characters. And it's like, so how many fights have you won versus how many did you lose? We came up with brackets, and we did like a tournament. And then we came up with this idea of like, so here's the champion for this year. Here is the last man standing or whatever. And unfortunately, it's been so long now, I can't tell you who won that first year. But this became an ongoing thing for several years where we would, do some superhero stuff. And the way it usually goes for us is like, we'll play something like, say, Teen Titans, and we'll get burnout on it. And we'll do that for maybe 3 months. I feel like a season is about how long our attention span tends to be. And then we'll say, well, let's play X-Men or something, and we'll do that. And then we would say, let's do more of that fighting game we were doing. And we would go back and we would do that again then. And then we would cycle through. We get tired of that. We'd say, okay, now let's do Justice League, or now let's do Fantastic Four, or whatever. And it was always the same game world, of course. And then we did it where every year, at least annually, we did the thing there for the first several years that my wife and I were married. Um, where we played out this fighting game, but not just a fighting game. It was, I also felt like it was kind of like, I don't know about you, but for me, like I'm a Street Fighter fan. That's my favorite fighting game, is Street Fighter. And we've never gotten a Street Fighter movie, whether it's live action or anime or anything. We've never gotten one that was how I wanted it, you know? And so with the role playing game, I kind of finally did that. We did sort of deal with that. And we did bring in bad guys then. We had villains from Mortal Kombat. Um, we brought in M. Bison from Street Fighter, just so on and so forth. There's another game that was really popular in the 90s. I can't remember what that game was called now. There was an ice guy named Glacius. I want to say maybe Killer Instinct. Is that the right one? Because fighting games were like super popular in the 90s, so it's easy for me to kind of not be able to keep track of them all. But I remember my friend Howard was like really into this ice guy named Glacius. And so we were bringing in, some of those guys, and there were some like obscure, what would it have been? I don't think it was Super Nintendo. It must have been N64. I think we had some characters from some N64 fighting games. Because I remember one they kept talking about, it was either called Prime Core Element or it was called Core Prime Element. But I remember they had this material that's kind of the MacGuffin in that game that everybody's trying to get their hands on. And we ended up with some of it on a spaceship of all places and kind of forgot about it. And then I don't know, at some point later on, that would have been, I think, when my wife was pregnant with our daughter. They this I'm going off topic, but I'm going to do it anyway. They went to this planet and it was an alien planet, but it was like more alien than we usually get in most movies and stuff. And it was this like two-level city built on like a cliff next to the ocean. And they had like a caste system. And the people on this planet, there was like two kinds of people. There were the people that had wings and the people who didn't. So the ones with wings got to live in the highest part of the city. And they were kind of like the very wealthy, the elites. They ran things, so on and so forth. And then the people without wings, they because I based it on the idea of like a dock or a pier or something like you would actually encounter, just like gigantic. So there were these big poles that went down in the water. And then there was this weird like sea fungus. It was a freshwater ocean on this planet. And so there was this weird sea fungus that would grow kind of like a spiral up these poles. And then there were people living in this stuff, and I kind of based it on the Ewok village from Star Wars. But there was a tavern in the Undercity, and because the fungus is what they had access to, they had this weird um alcohol that they were making out of fungus. And I remember describing it to the players as like you drink this pint of alcohol and it tastes like this buttery mushroom kind of a taste. And and then they themselves were just kind of rolling a dice and it was like if it's evens I like it, if it's odds I don't. That kind of thing. And the point is they brought some back to the ship and they left some of that alcohol next to the I don't know now if it's called core prime element or prime core element, but whatever. And the fungal alcohol turned into a person. And my wife made a character called Devo, as in devolve. And so she had powers where she had mutation or whatever, where she could either evolve you and give you qualities you didn't have before, or she could devolve you and kind of make you worse. Um, but yeah, the point is that the core prime element stuff that came from this fighting game. Sorry for the tangent, but that's probably a thing that I'm not going to remember to make a video about for this channel. And um, yeah, so I just figured I'd get it out there. But yeah, man, the fighting game, that whole thing was really cool, and I couldn't tell you now why we quit doing it. I don't know. I guess at some point, because my wife's friends had kind of like a falling out, they quit. coming around. And I feel like they were maybe the ones driving all of that. It was funny because you would think that Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball was like really geared towards a male demographic, but like all my wife's friends were into it. So it's funny how that works out. But at any rate, I can't think of this era of our game and kind of not mention it. It was um we really liked it. Another game from back then, since I'm just going off the rails willy-nilly, another game we really liked was Blood Rain, that first Blood Rain thing. And we did some stuff with her in game, but I'll be honest, I can't remember what it was now. I know she was in the game. I remember John Redbridge hitting on her. But yeah, I couldn't really tell you what we did with Blood Rain now. I ought to run some more of that. I should run another fighting game again, and I should run some Blood Rain stuff. My wife loved Blood Rain. She was a huge fan. My wife was kind of goth when we met, which is funny because now she's like the polar opposite of that. She dyes her hair blonde and wears a lot of pink and so on and so forth. And when I met my wife, she was always like cosplaying as Death from DC Comics of the Endless, from the Sandman comics. Um, at any rate, I've I've droned on, long enough. I'll wrap this one up. As always, thank you for listening, guys. You guys are awesome. Make sure you're still subscribed. Make sure you leave us a comment. Did you ever play this game? The volleyball game? If so, what are your memories of it? Or, whatever, Blood Rain or something else. I just like hearing from you guys. I like talking to you. So leave me a comment, hit like, all that jazz. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.